And welcome. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We have a great program for you this morning, featuring a conversation with Robert Kaplan and Stephen Kotkin, who is a FPRI senior fellow in our Eurasia program and also a professor at Princeton. They're going to be talking about China post-communism. Before we get started, and I introduce Bob Kaplan, for whom most of you don't need an introduction, I just want to briefly talk about some of the great programs we have coming up next week, this week and next week. We have on Monday, we have our Asia Program Director, Jacques Delisle, talking about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. This is the new trade agreement and economic agreement in Asia, which has at least 15 Asian and Southeast Asian countries coming together to form a free trade area. That's December 4th from 10 to 11 a.m. That's tomorrow, excuse me. Next week, we have Charles Ray talking with our trustee, Ambassador Charles, our trustee, not trustee, he's also trustee. Our trustee, Charles Ray, who's also the chair of our brand new Africa program, is going to be talking with Ambassador Hank Cohen on, that's December 7th from 3 to 4 p.m., talking about U.S. policy in Africa and how it's evolved over the years. And Ambassador Cohen has a brand new book that he's going to be talking about as well, U.S. Policy Towards Africa, 8 Decades of Realpolitik. On December 8th from 2 to 3 p.m., we'll have Bob Kaplan back again, talking with our other FPRI senior fellow, John Noggle, who's also the host of our mainline series, so you all know him too. They're going to be talking about the new administration and how they're going to approach the geopolitical challenges they face. And finally, on December 10th, from 9 to 10 a.m., we're going to have a program on China's growing role in Central Asia, and that's going to be moderated by our Eurasia Program Director, Chris Miller. Again, that's December 10th from 9 to 10, so we have some great programs. Robert Kaplan really needs no introduction, but he is the holder of the inaugural holder of the Robert Strauss Hupé Chair in Geopolitics at FPRI, and member of our board of advisors, and a prolific author of 19 books, including the forthcoming this spring, early spring, I think January is the pub date, The Good American. It's a story of Robert Gersony, who was the USG's greatest humanitarian that you may have never heard of. Bob's a prolific author. As I mentioned, he is constantly in the major press, writing op-eds and articles, and he was also notably the recipient of the Benjamin Franklin Award given by FPRI for outstanding scholars, soldiers, or statesmen. Before I turn the floor over to Bob, I just want to very quickly do a few housekeeping notes. One, if you have questions, please start putting them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Not the chat box, that's for technical issues if you have any. And please tell us if you do. Don't wait till the end because maybe we can help you solve them. Also in the chat window, we'll be placing some maps to the regions that our speakers are going to be talking about this morning if you'd like to orient yourself during that discussion. We'll also be making a video of this call, so if you want to watch it again, or if you missed part of it, or have friends you think should see it, you'll be able to avail yourself of that. Finally, I would like to thank our supporters and our donors and our board for their generous support and assistance to FPRI. We can't do what we do without you. If you're not a member yet, there will be links in the chat box to become a member, and I encourage you to check out our website, www.fpri.org. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Bob Kaplan.
Thank you, Raleigh. And likewise, Stephen Kotkin, a professor at Princeton, needs little introduction. He's justly famous for three monumental volumes on the life of Joseph Stalin. That makes him an historian on the history of Soviet communism, and also very knowledgeable with a sense of historical periods moving from one to the other, that the ground is always moving under our feet, whether we realize it or not. Well, as a young reporter in Eastern Europe, I assumed at the time that the Cold War would never end because I was young and I had not known any previous eras. Well, it did end. I was wrong. And that brings me to China and the history of the Communist Party of China. Is it just another passing dynasty? What will the next phase of Chinese history bring us? I'll turn it over to Steve to get us started.
Thank you so much, Bob. I thank FPRI for the honor of the invitation. It's a remarkable venue. Whether in historic Philadelphia or now in Princeton or in New York or now on Zoom. It's always been a great platform, and it's an honor, as I said, for me to be on again with FPRI. I'm going to make a three-part presentation today. The first part is going to be about how China is communist. Then I'm going to talk about the vulnerabilities. And then I'm going to talk about what a post-communist China could potentially look like and how we might get there. So part one, how China is actually communist. We're seeing a lot of bashing of China by using the communist label, and it's taking on a political tinge. One of the great things about FPRI is it's a nonpartisan venue for discussing foreign policy. And so my assertion that China is not, my assertion that China is communist is not a political one. It's an analytical one. And I've been making it all these years, including the years where people forgot that China was communist. And so how is it communist and why is this important? Well, it has a Leninist party structure. The Leninist party structure is one of the greatest inventions in the history of totalitarianism. And it's not just a regular one-party authoritarianism. We have many one-party authoritarianisms where the political party is more or less a sham. It's just a vehicle for a certain personal regime and for certain corruption to flourish within that particular regime. This is something different. This is where the Communist Party is inside every organization of the country, every part of the economy. It's in the school system as well as the bureaucracy. The party is a shadow institution which mirrors every other institution but ensures Communist Party control. So inside the state bureaucracy, there are party officials. Inside the school system, as I said, there are party officials. Inside the military, party officials. This Leninist structure you can even see in the private economy, where there are Communist Party cells inside privately owned companies. More so now even than just a few years ago, as they revive the Leninist party structure. This is very, very important because it enables a degree of Communist Party control over the country's institutions, social life, and economy, which is very different from a garden variety single party authoritarianism that doesn't permit other parties to organize or that permits them only within very narrow limits so that they can never threaten the regime. This is much more pervasive and much more powerful than that. There is something called the nomenclatura or the list of appointments. In order to be the director of a state-owned factory, in order to be a provincial official, in order to actually achieve any significant career position, even at the university, you need to be approved by the party. You need to be on the list of approved appointments known as the nomenclatura. This is a very powerful tool for centralization and, as I said, for political, economic, and social control. The second piece of how China is communist is, yes, there's an ideological component. We have been very dismissive of communist ideology in China. We've said that they're transcended it. They're capitalist now. They're cynical about any communist ideology. They talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, wink, wink, and they don't really mean it. However, that's also not true. It turns out that there are components to the ideology that remain powerful and that it's very important for us to understand. If you think about the left in the long sweep of the modern epoch, it's got three planks. One is anti-capitalism, one is anti-imperialism, and one is anti-statism. The anti-statist plank proved to be a failure because it's very hard to impose anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism without the state as your main instrument. So for the most part, anarchists and syndicalists have been squeezed out of power in the few instances when they've come to power. And they've also been erased largely from the history of the left. The anti-statist plank still arises every now and then. We'll see it with some elements of defund the police, for example, and other expressions where the state is seen as inherently evil or inherently captive by malevolent interests. But for the most part, we're talking about anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. On the left, there's a little bit of a civil war that flares sometimes very severely between those who are anti-capitalism full stop and will buck no compromise on getting rid of markets and private property, and those who are in favor of just regulating, redistribution, and regulation of markets and private property. They don't like capitalism, but they understand that they need to accommodate to capitalism and that they should regulate it, make it in their minds fairer, more just, but not eliminate markets and private property. This civil war on the left, are you a full Leninist or you are a revisionist? Are you someone who believes that capitalism needs to be eliminated, or are you someone who believes it needs to be ameliorated because it has problems? This civil war on the left is a global phenomenon, and it plays out inside communist China today as it did across Europe in the time when Lenin was alive and even before Lenin. What's important about this ideology is it's linked to the Leninist structure, and communism turns out to be an all or nothing proposition. You cannot be half communist. In fact, when you begin to open up a communist system, when you begin to liberalize a communist system, you actually are beginning to destroy your communist system unwittingly. We saw this in Hungary in '56, we saw this in Czechoslovakia in '68, and we saw it under Gorbachev as well. Because if you say, let's democratize the Communist Party and have discussion inside the party, some people will say, well, I don't like the Communist Party. I want to have other parties besides communism. And so there's no way to stop a liberalization of communism at a point that's stable. Once you open up politically, it begins to unravel and you lose the Communist Party's monopoly, which, as I said, is an all or nothing proposition. The Communist Chinese understand this very well. Now, they have pivoted sometimes on the anti-capitalism. Many people inside China, including top party officials, have embraced capitalism in part. They have not pivoted on the anti-imperialism and the so-called century of humiliation and the idea that China has been mistreated by outside powers. Never mind that more Chinese were killed by Chinese rulers than any outside powers in Chinese history. Anyhow, so this is my first proposition, that China is a communist system and that this has very considerable real practical implications for us understanding the possibilities and limits of that system. Let me get to my second point, the vulnerability. Ironically, the area that we thought was dead, the area that we thought was cynical, the area that we thought we didn't have to pay attention to, ideology, is the area of greatest vulnerability with a communist regime. And that vulnerability comes in two parts. One, some people really are Marxists. And they really do believe that China has gone too far in liberalizing the economy and allowing legal markets and private property to a certain extent. If you've read Jude Blanchett's book on the new Red Guards, you will see that is a very significant part of the Chinese landscape today. The people who are adherents to communist ideology in its purest form. But even a greater threat to the regime is reform communism. And reform communism is a threat because it's naive. Once again, it says that if you open up the system, democratize the system, you can improve its function, you can make a one-party system better, more responsive to the needs of the people, allowing internal debate, allowing possibly even public debate. The problem with this proposition for the Chinese communist regime, and why it's vulnerable, is that there is no reform equilibrium. There is no point at which you begin a reform and then you reach a stable equilibrium. When you open up politically, you unravel the system, or you have to stop the opening up and crack down again. Because as I said, communism is an all or nothing monopoly proposition, and you cannot be half communist. If you lose the party's monopoly, right, the entire regime unravels. And so this vulnerability, reform communism, is very well understood by the current Chinese regime because they've studied their Chinese communist history and they've studied their global communist history. All right, let me get to point number 3, which is the landscape of post-communism, and then try to bring this all together with a concluding statement. We have a lot of historical cases now. We have a full picture of the landscape of post-communism across much of Eurasia. And it looks like we can discern general patterns. When you lose a communist regime, once again, by this unwitting opening up on the political side, which gives you a vision of reform communism that is an auto-liquidation unintentionally, we see that the end product, the point that they reach, is a kind of xenophobic, ultra-nationalist, authoritarian, right-wing regime. We see this, for example, in Putin's Russia. We see it throughout Central Asia. We see it in much of Eastern Europe even, Hungary, Poland. We see it in Southeastern Europe with the post-Yugoslav regimes. We see everywhere not an identical regime. We don't see everything being exactly the same, but we see a pattern where they've gone from a communist monopoly to a more amorphous party of power, usually with a personalistic regime, usually with rampant corruption where they've stolen the property and they have a lock on the economy in addition to the politics, where they ramp up the xenophobia and the ultranationalism and the enemies, whether that's internal enemies like liberals, gays, Jews, Roma, external enemies like the Great Satan, the United States, George Soros, or you fill in the blank, right? We see a pattern here, and that pattern is an authoritarian replacement of communism, which has some version of markets and private property. They've given up the communist economics because it's much better for the elites to own the property rather than just to manage it. And we see redistribution among the elites, rampant corruption among the elites. And so we see a pattern that we might see in the case of China as well, should this regime at some point end for whatever reason, either internal implosion, which has been the case across most of Eurasia, or because of external pressure. And so what this means is, if you want to go from communism, a communist regime with a Leninist structure and a certain ideological framework that has not disappeared, even though it's gotten very hollow. If you want to go from that to Putin, or from that to Orban, or from that to fill in the blank, you have a problem. And the problem is Gorbachev. That's what's in the middle between your current regime in China and what they might be satisfied with, that is to say, a hyper-nationalist Chinese authoritarian regime that was based on traditional values, ownership of the property, and was not vulnerable to dissolution because of the one-party monopoly. So the Chinese communist regime has studied this history. They know it at least as well as I do. They teach it at the party school. Xi Jinping speaks about this in public frequently, as do other top officials. This is not something they're going to let happen to themselves. They're not going to let a Gorbachev politically liberalize that system because they know the outcome. Nor are they going to let the ultra-Marxists regain power to undo the private economy completely. And that's because they need the private economy to generate the growth and the jobs. The GDP growth and the jobs come from the private sector. At the same time, the private sector is a threat to them because it's an alternative source of power, it's an alternative source of wealth and independence. And so you see in China an opening on the economic side, and then a fear that they've opened too much on the economic side and trying to strangle the private sector again by having the state-owned economic sector expand, and also by inserting communist control through the party into the private sector. You see this now proliferating across the private sector, making sure that communist officials are on the boards of private companies, for example, and giving contracts to state-owned companies at private companies' expense, and having the banking sector make loans to the state-owned economy rather than to the private sector. You see a tremendous worry over the dynamism of the private sector because it is a threat to Communist Party monopoly. At the same time, they cannot strangle the private sector completely because then they lose the economic dynamism, the growth, and the jobs. And so this refusal to engage in political liberalism because it's suicide, and this back and forth like an accordion on the economic liberalization, more, less, more, less. This is the dynamic we've now had in China for some period of time because, to repeat, it's a communist regime. And so the other side of this is not necessarily a less competitive problem for the United States. The other side of this is not necessarily a country which will become an ally of the United States. A non-communist or post-communist China is still a challenge for the United States. The societal dynamism, the economic dynamism, and the nationalism will all still be there. In fact, they're there now. One of the things you see in the current communist regime is the post-communist political possibilities are already rampant inside the existing structures. They need to maintain the communist monopoly, yes, because it's all about the survival of this regime. But at the same time, they're filling up some of the hollowness of the ideology to retain the Leninist political structure. They're filling up some of the hollowness of the ideology with a post-communist style, xenophobic, ultra-nationalist, ideological, political proliferation. And so China is a challenge for us, even in a post-communist light. It's not the communist regime itself that's the challenge for us. In fact, my argument today is that the communist regime is the challenge for China because it's limiting how much private economic activity they will allow. And it's inherently unstable because it doesn't permit accountability and political opening without liquidation. The challenge for the United States is China. The spectacular achievements of China in our lifetime, going from the Maoist self-destruction and a per capita GDP in the low hundreds to a post $10,000 plus, even at nominal rates of exchange, per capita GDP, with the second biggest economy in the world, is an incredible achievement. Very, very impressive. And that's not going away. And that is something we will have to confront here in the United States. Whether or not the communist regime survives this dilemma that it has of not being able to open up politically without destroying itself, and worrying about how much it can open up economically also without undermining itself. Anyway, that's my message today. China is a challenge, and the communism is a challenge for the Chinese. Bob, we're back to you.
Right, yes. I think that China is the idea that China is somehow going to be easier to deal with, exactly as you suggest, in a post-communist era is nonsense. I mean, Russia was not easier to deal with after after communism fell, and so are a number of other places. But I think what we need to do is these are large internal forces that we cannot stop. There already is an ideological component to our conflict with China. China has gone from being an elite issue to a popular issue in the United States. But I think what we need to do is, and this is what diplomacy and geopolitics are all about, Steve, it's about dialing down the temperature if we can. Now, so the first thing the Biden administration needs to do is not to make concessions to China, but to try to get the U.S. and China from a pre-Cuban Missile Crisis situation to a post-Cuban Missile Crisis situation. By that, I mean, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were no test ban treaties, no hotlines, not the regular summitry that happened in the 70s, no détente. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed both powers made both powers stare into the abyss, and they didn't like what they saw. So they drew parameters around the Cold War, some rules of the road, some way to keep the Cold War from becoming a hot war. And that's something that the Biden administration needs to do after the disorganized craziness of the Trump White House. It needs to say, we've got these difficulties with you, let's set some rules of the road, so that the chances of getting into an accidental hot conflict in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea are lessen those chances, so that we can have a tense dialogue without, and at the same time prevent the ultimate catastrophe in geopolitics, which is great power war. So I think that's where the Biden administration has to go, not towards concessions, not to dialing up automatically the ideological component, because that's already there, and we need to tone it down and to try to make the conflict less existential. After all, we conducted negotiations and had agreements with Communist China before under Mao, with the Soviet Union under Brezhnev. This is where we should be headed, not solving this problem, but setting a few markers and rules of the road so that the parties are less likely to go from cold conflict hot conflict. And again, I don't want to overemphasize this Cold War element because it's happening under an entirely different context than the original Cold War was. So I think that's where we have to go at this point with China, because, and it will be difficult because, as I said before, it's no longer an elite issue that elites argue about. You know, it's become a popular issue because of trade and other things. So why don't I stop it there? And, you know, and Steve, do you have any remarks about that?
So the idea that we have to coexist with China is clear. They're not going away. Russia has collapsed twice and is still there. The Tsarist regime collapsed, the Soviets collapsed, and they're still there. One could say something similar about Iran and all other ancient civilizations. They occupy the same planet, and we do need to coexist. The issue of restoring deterrence and restoring balance in the relationship, and then having diplomacy and dialogue simultaneous with that. One of my problems with the hawks is not that they're hawks, but that they don't have a strong enough diplomatic component. If you're going to apply deterrence, restore deterrence, and apply pressure, what is it going to get you? What are you looking to achieve? What's the diplomacy part of it where you get to a better situation, as you outlined it, managing the differences, managing the tensions? One of the things I don't like about the doves is they're all in favor of diplomacy, but they don't understand leverage. They don't understand the need to restore deterrence sometimes and to apply pressure in order to negotiate from a position of relative strength rather than relative weakness. And so for me, I sign on to everything you just said with the proviso that we restore the deterrence and we restore the diplomacy simultaneously.
Yeah, I would just add that based on your 3 points, the next 20 years in China could be far more tumultuous and interesting than the last 20 years. Because as China creates a larger middle classes are notoriously ungrateful, and they hold government to a higher standard. They have wants and needs and desires and complaints that they voice that peasants never did when under subsistence agriculture. So I think China becomes harder to govern rather than easier to govern in the years ahead, despite all the electronic digital behavior monitoring that's going on. Raleigh, why don't I turn it over to you to monitor the Q&A?
Okay, thank you. Thanks again for a fascinating discussion. We have a lot of questions. First one from Joseph Della Penna, who says, I was excited about the end of communism when the USSR collapsed, yet remind myself of the history of Buddhism. It died in the land of its birth more than a millennium ago, yet it continues to live on, to thrive, and to heavily influence China and other countries. Any comments on that?
So when we talk about the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, it has those two components. One is the political structures. The Communist Party held the Union together. The Soviet Union was actually a federation. The Communist Party was not a federation. The loss of the party, the elimination of the party's monopoly, also eliminated the control over the federation. It became voluntary and it dissolved. And then you see traditional values, traditional Russian identity, as well as Westernization and liberal ideas compete in post-communist Russia, as well as the other successor states around Eurasia. I expect in China something very similar. I expect a grab bag of competing values which are rooted in Chinese history and revival of them, including Buddhism, but not only, as a package to find a usable past and a usable set of values that can be taught in schools and that can be shared by a nation. Now, will there be a democratic version of this or an authoritarian version of this, where there's the freedom to practice certain religious tendencies, there's the freedom not to believe in certain ideas? That's always the big question when authoritarian regimes give way. Are we going to get yet another authoritarian regime to replace them? Unfortunately, there are very few cases where an authoritarian regime has given way to a stable, prosperous, peaceful rule of law, constitutional order, right? Taiwan is one of the great examples, and Taiwan is probably the single most important piece of real estate in East Asia right now for that very reason.
Yeah, I would just add, though, that, an overarching reality of this discussion is that there's an assumption among the American elite and people that somehow China will be easier to deal with it when it's not communist. And it could be the reverse. It could be even harder to deal with if it's nationalistic, xenophobic, and feels itself under siege and dials up nationalism in the South China Sea and in other places. Remember, we probably had an easier time dealing with János Kadar, the liberal communist or so-called, when he ruled Hungary than we have with Viktor Orban. And we certainly, have more problems with Putin, one could argue, than we had with late Brezhnev or early Gorbachev, etc. So we shouldn't assume that that there's some sort of theological endpoint where China will suddenly become friendly and we will get over this problem and we will move to a new phase of history that is easier.
You've sort of answered some of our questions in here, but I'll ask them because there are little pieces of them that you might want to comment on. First, JJ Malutis asks, would a nationalist post-communist regime in China be more dangerous than a communist structured regime to the Western world? Would it be easier for the US to deal with a strictly nationalist or quasi-communist regime? And I'll also go down and add to that, Carlos Rivers asks if PRC commits military aggression. There was another one that was more on U.S. relationships. Sorry. William Borum, what are the chances of China miscalculating U.S. resolve and strength and tumbling into the world? And we also have a anonymous attendee asks, while Taiwan was never communist, it did see democratic transition from one-party authoritarian regime to multi-party democracy, and the President Lee Teng-hui essentially pushed the country towards democracy rather than Russia-like authoritarian regime. Is it possible a similar Lee-like figure in China could potentially push China in a similar direction? And I will add, again, how would the U.S. deal with this?
Well, let me start off by saying that what I fear is an explicitly nationalist regime in China, more so than now, because some of the problems we have with China have to do with territory, with Taiwan, with Xinjiang, with its treatment in Hong Kong, and an explicitly more nationalist regime than the current communist regime, could be more militant in those areas, especially if it felt itself weak or under siege. Because remember, there are examples in history when it's weak regimes that get into war rather than strong regimes. The Turkish invasion of Cyprus was driven by a very weak minority, left of center socialist prime minister Bülent Ecevit, precisely because he was under siege from his political opponents on the right, and was driven into this. So this is my fear, of a more explicitly nationalist regime.
We have an interesting question from Tristan Matthijs, who asks, why should a post-communist China remain a single country and not instead break up into rivaling states as it did during most of its history? Wouldn't this be a reduced threat to the West?
I would just say that China is not only a threat. China is not only a challenge. China is also an opportunity. to repeat, they have a gigantic talent pool. They have fantastic universities and laboratories. They have a very dynamic society and entrepreneurial people, a dynamic market sector inside their country. They have a large diaspora. They contribute to American universities, across the continent. Yes, some of them are involved in activities which are illegal, like, for example, theft of intellectual property, and that needs to be prosecuted in the cases where it's happening. But China is not only a threat, or not even predominantly a threat necessarily. The biggest threat to the United States is the United States. We're the only country that can undermine our way of life, our political system, our standard of living, all that we've achieved. No other country has the power to do that to us. We alone have that power over ourselves. And so in managing the tensions and relationship with China and avoiding the hot war, there have to be areas of cooperation because they're beneficial to the United States. The last 40 years of U.S. China policy have been very naive, but they have not been without benefits to the American people, myself included, and others on this Zoom call. And so I want to see a smarter application of policy so that the challenges and the opportunities are both present in our policy. That doesn't mean we go back to the naivete, but it also doesn't mean that we push confrontation to the point where we back them into a corner and or we fail to take advantage of all that they have to offer to the world, not just to the United States, but in their immediate neighborhood. This is why it's much more difficult to imagine a successful China policy than the containment policy we had vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, right? When you're 1% of global trade, which is what the Soviets were, and when your global trade is only hydrocarbons, which is what the Soviets were, and if you're excluded from the world economy, the others don't lose very much. In fact, let's buy your oil and gas, but otherwise not allow technology transfer into your country legally, right? Here with China, it's a much more difficult proposition, obviously. And so we cannot get into a situation where we imagine that we're going to be able to contain and hold China down. That's a self-defeating proposition. And it also feeds a politics inside China that we don't want to encourage. Having said that, I do think Taiwan is a critical case study for us. What happened in Taiwan over the course of a long period of time is the Taiwanese people democratized their country. We didn't do that for them. They did that for themselves. And the way they did that was that the ruling party lost its monopoly and didn't use force to try to hold on to its monopoly. That's something we cannot really determine inside communist China. If the communists willingly relinquish their monopoly, that would be a way to move from the current communist regime to a post-communist regime, potentially democratizing and having political competition, pluralism, although the rule of law question would stick out in a really big way. Because Taiwan had rule of law in market terms over the economy before it had full rule of law in the political sphere, something that China is nowhere near right now. But if you look at the challenges to the regime in China, if you look at, for example, Manchuria or Mongolia, they overcame those challenges with massive assimilation and culture and migration. There is very little Manchurian, Mongolian separate identity flourishing, even in those historic regions, because they've been overrun by Han Chinese settlers. That was less possible in the case of Xinjiang and Tibet. The Chinese have tried through Han migration and settlement to pacify these regions. but they're not as attractive to farmers, to settlers, Xinjiang and Tibet, as Manchuria and Mongolia were. And so they're much more difficult for the Chinese regime to assimilate. And in fact, there were periods in history when they were not part of China for important periods of time. But it's the political challenges. It's the Hong Kong and the Taiwan that are the deepest challenges for this regime, because those are places that speak the Chinese language and partake in larger Chinese culture, but are democratic rule of law as a challenging political system that's essentially indigenous. The Chinese Communist regime is undoing the rule of law, democratic Hong Kong, because it is a threat as an alternative model to the mainland Chinese Communist monopoly. They would be keen to do the same with Taiwan, and it's up to us. We have much more leverage, much more opportunity in the case of Taiwan to protect an alternative, indigenous, rule of law, democratic system there than we did in the case of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not over yet, and we shouldn't give up, but Taiwan is a critical place for us to make a stand, to be less ambiguous, to be more supportive, but as Bob said, not in provocative ways that elicit the opposite behavior in Beijing that we're looking for.
I would just add that the Chinese are going to be looking for early signals from the Biden administration, whether there will be a continual debate among American elites about whether we should or should not defend Taiwan in the case of war, or whether the Biden administration at some point says, we will defend Taiwan. It's in our national interest. It's, like we defended Berlin during the Cold War, kind of. The Chinese will be looking for a signal on that one, because this is a debate that we shouldn't have after the mainland Chinese start some sort of aggression against Taiwan. I mean, this debate's been going on for some time, and unless it's resolved in a way that where we recognize the importance of Taiwan, it's really going to weaken our leverage throughout East Asia, from Japan to Australia.
I should point out, to amplify what Bob just said, that the Republicans in the Senate are very strongly in favor of defending Taiwan, and that it's not solely the Biden administration, the executive, which will have a voice here. And so that's going to be important in the American political system, that we get on side and build a consensus over Taiwan and not be at cross purposes domestically. I should also add that the status quo in Taiwan works for us. We're pro status quo. It doesn't work for the communist regime in Beijing, because they were just as naive as we were. We thought that if we integrated communist China economically, it would become more like us politically. It would evolve in our direction. In fact, it didn't. The Chinese communist regime looked at Taiwan and said, if we integrate with them economically, they'll want to join with us politically. And in fact, the opposite has happened. The deep economic integration has coincided with a deepening of separate Taiwanese identity, not Chinese identity on the island. However, that's a problem for Beijing, not for us. We are pro-status quo, and we should be unambiguously pro-status quo. It's the Chinese who are revisionist on Taiwan, and they're the ones who are talking about claiming Taiwan by force. We don't want to change the status quo. We want to maintain the status quo, that Taiwan does not get incorporated into mainland China by force.
We have a lot of questions and not a lot of time. So I want to turn to two topics. First is economic, the second is human rights. But Jerry Rubenstein asks a question. He says, from an economic point of view, the parallels between China and prior communist regimes fail to recognize the power of China as the world's marketplace. Represents a place of 1.4 billion people, a marketplace that corporations cannot ignore. The new trade agreement in Asia represents 1/3 of the world's population. If China does have a growing middle class, it will become a world economic powerhouse. How do we and the U.S. face this potential new competitor on the world scene? For example, will the U.S. dollar remain as a reserve currency? If not, what are the implications? And I'm going to add another question from Mark Walters, who says, you make a great point about physical conflict, but what about monetary conflict? Is there such a thing as mutual assured destruction in an economic sense that we can address with our tools of power?
Yeah, what I would say is keep in mind, even were China a democracy, a stable democracy, given its size and its cultural and economic dynamism, it would still be a competitor, probably. Just think of our trade tensions with Germany, which only has about under 100 million people. China has 1.3 or what at 1.4 billion people or whatever. So these problems are not going away. I think monetary policy, like military policy, will be determined above all by our political policy. The Federal Reserve or whatever is not going to go down an independent, provocative path on China without coordination, with Congress and the executive on that field. It probably just won't do that, especially in an era where the Federal Reserve is more politicized and under more pressure from the other two branches of government and from the popular mindset than it ever was before.
So China's economic dynamism, its wealth, is the best argument I've heard for us to invest in ourselves and compete. Let's invest in our human capital. Let's invest in our infrastructure. Let's invest in our good governance. Let's raise our game. Let's compete with China. China doesn't have a lot of friends. China's a lonely power. Authoritarian regimes don't do alliances very well because they require trust. The United States has got more alliances than any country has ever had in history. Those alliances require care. They require reshaping in some cases. They can't be left on autopilot. But that's a very powerful instrument for us. One of the great things about the Trump administration and its disruption has been that it's raised a lot of questions that were either implicit or dormant. And it also showed us what the issues are, and in some ways what our strengths are or need to be in addressing those issues. And so Trump has changed the conversation in part. It hasn't been Trump alone, but he's played a big role in putting competition with China squarely in front of the American public. But how are we going to do that? And the answer is not the way that he did it. The answer may be better than the way he did it. But he was right to put that on the agenda. And so once again, let's not be afraid. We're the United States of America, right? We invented Silicon Valley. We invented biotech. We're there with the vaccine. We have all the capacity we need to compete with China. Our political system is superior to them. The dollar is far superior to the Chinese currency. Who is going to hold trillions of dollars in Chinese reserves right now? Who in their right mind is going to trade the dollar and the deep capital markets of the United States for the Chinese ones in the immediate future? Very few people are going to do that and benefit and prosper from that. We have tremendous assets. We have tremendous capabilities. China doesn't scare me. What scares me is when we forget about our own advantages and we undermine ourselves. I'm ready to compete with China all across the board, avoiding the hot war, like Rob said. You know what the beauty of a Cold War is? It's not a hot war.
Questions on human rights. We've already talked a little bit about Hong Kong, but of course the Uyghurs comes to our attention as a human rights issue. And David Graff asks, what leverage does the U.S. have in getting China to reduce its human rights abuses?
I question the degree of leverage we have. I'm worried, rather I should say I'm worried about it. I first went to Xinjiang in 1994, interviewing people there. And I can tell you the atmosphere was awful. It was very intense. There was hatred of Han Chinese was expressed openly. And since then, and the Chinese policy has simply been to gradually eat away at their culture while overwhelming them with Han migrants into the cities of Xinjiang, like Urumqi and Kashgar and other places. I was there as recently as 3 years ago. They've taken all the Turkic Uyghur Muslims in Kashgar and put them into apartment buildings, which are not very nice. And they're just trying to control and eat away at their culture, to erase their culture in the way that erase their cultural identity in the way that Chinese have been able to do with Manchurians and Inner Mongolians. However, the United States, being the United States, is going to bring this issue up at the table. But if we're smart, we shouldn't demand any public declarations of improvement on the part of the Chinese government. We should be satisfied with an improvement in the situation without public statements about it. So that way we might be able to get them to move on the issue, provided we don't want to take the credit publicly for having them move on the issue. That's the best that I could say, because the regime sees the Uyghurs as a kind of an inchoate threat. The Uyghurs don't have, to the degree of the Tibetans, a kind of global elite leadership like the Dalai Lama has. They're more unformed, more prone to eruption or explosion in the case of an environmental catastrophe. So there's more of and also the Uyghurs are Muslims. And that's another thing that scares the elites in Beijing. So it's going to be a hard issue to get Beijing to move on. But in the context of talks, private talks, where we don't demand a public refutation of what Beijing has done, we might be able to get some movement.
Have a comment and a question from Scotty Scottsko. First of all, he says a bravo performance, and we have several other comments like that. He asks, is there a potential for a struggle for prominence between the CCP and the PLA? And I would broaden that. Are there fissures within some of the power elites in China?
Yeah, excellent questions, all of them. I wish I had more time to be able to answer them at the length that they deserve. The PLA serves the communist regime. This is the thing about communist regimes. The institutions are not state for the country, they're for preservation of the regime. And so that is a potential source of conflict and tension if the interests of the regime and the interests of the nation, as perceived by the elites in the army, diverge. And if preservation of the regime comes at the interests that army men perceive as more Chinese interest or Chinese state interest or Chinese nation interest. Let me just say that there is debate in China. It's not always public debate, but there is significant debate among the elites about whether Xi Jinping's hard line abroad is serving Chinese interests, about whether the relationship with the U.S. has gone off the rails, not because of the U.S., but because of Chinese actions, about whether the forward position vis-a-vis other countries, like, for example, punishment of Australia, punishment of South Korea before that, punishment of Norway, whether those serve Chinese interests in the long term. Just like Xinjiang doesn't enhance the reputation of the Beijing ruling group, either at home with some constituencies and certainly abroad. So many other issues that we regard as misbehavior or miscalculation generate debate inside China. For us, once again, no Pygmalion, right? We're not going to make communist China into America, right, by putting on new clothes and teaching different manners in a kind of George Bernard Shaw Pygmalion fashion here. We are instead going to manage the challenges and seize the opportunities so that we don't have a hot war, but we're not afraid to prosecute a Cold War, as provided it is in American interests rather than solely to punish someone we perceive as a threat.
We still have 20 open questions. So clearly we're going to have a Kaplan Kotkin 2.0 and have you both back. So before I close out, any final comments, Bob or Stephen?
I would only say that there was a time 10 or 15 years ago where China had friends in Washington. It had friends in the media. It had friends in Congress. If they were not exactly friends, but people, people's level of excitement or dislike about China was very toned down and it was nuanced. China has no friends in Washington now, really. The media has turned against it. Congress has turned against it. In fact, it's one of the two things that, the main thing that Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump agreed on was the hard line against China. So that's going to be a challenge going forward in terms of the Biden administration if it seeks to carve out a more nuanced policy.
I should say that they've also lost the American business community.
Yeah.
Which used to go very much lobbying in favor of a softer line vis-a-vis China that would evolve. And losing the American business community was a very significant self-inflicted wound that Beijing inflicted on itself. Let me conclude, however, by saying, let's remember there's Australia. Let's remember that there's Japan. Let's remember that there's India. Let's remember that we're not alone. Let's remember that there's a transatlantic relationship that has been cultivated over decades in bipartisan fashion. Let's remember that there are all regions of the world, the Middle East, Africa, South America, which want to benefit from China's dynamism and entrepreneurialism, but also don't want to fall under China's sway. That's our opportunity to seize at this moment. And that opportunity must coincide with being a better example and as well as a better friend to all of those countries that would like to see us engage more over this China challenge. Challenge plus opportunity, reinvestment in America, remember our friends, fix those relationships, and not be against everything China does, but figure out how to live with China on a single planet.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Stephen. That was a fascinating discussion, and we have many comments, and with apologies to those who asked wonderful questions, but we just don't have time. So thank you to our viewers. Thank you for your support. If you're not a supporter or a member, please consider becoming one, and we wish you well. Take care. Be safe during these difficult times.